Please don't make me dance, Dad. The words were barely louder than a whisper, yet they landed with the weight of a thunderstorm inside Ethan Caldwell's chest. Around them, crystal chandeliers scattered golden light across the grand ballroom of the St. Regis in Manhattan. A string quartet played softly near the marble staircase. Champagne glasses clinked. Investors laughed. Cameras flashed. It looked like the perfect charity gala, the kind that filled society magazines and business headlines. But none of that mattered to the 12-year-old boy standing beside one of the richest men in America. Mason Caldwell kept his eyes fixed on the floor. His small fingers tightened around the sleeve of his navy blazer. He had practiced this smile before leaving home. Ethan knew because he had watched his son try. 3 times in front of the mirror. 3 times before giving up. Across the room, guests greeted Ethan with admiration. Billion-dollar founders. Athletes. Politicians. People who wanted a photo, a favor, a conversation. Yet the moment their eyes drifted toward Mason, something changed. Some looked away too quickly. Others offered sympathetic smiles they thought were kind. A few simply stared for a second too long. Mason noticed every single one. Children always did. Especially children who had learned what it felt like to be different. Ethan placed a reassuring hand on his son's shoulder. "You don't have to do anything tonight," he said gently. Mason nodded, but his expression never changed. It had been nearly 3 years since the accident that left scars across part of his face. 3 years since his laughter had become rare. 3 years since Ethan had spent more money than most people could imagine trying to help his son feel like himself again. Specialists, therapists, retreats, private schools. Nothing seemed to reach the place where Mason had hidden himself away. The boy who once danced through every room in the house had slowly disappeared. "Dad, can we leave early?" Mason asked quietly. Ethan forced a smile. "We'll see." The answer sounded stronger than he felt. Because the truth was simple. He wasn't here for the gala. He wasn't here for the donors. He wasn't here for the cameras. He was here because someone had convinced him that maybe being around people again might help his son. So far, it wasn't working. On the far side of the ballroom, Naomi Brooks balanced a silver tray against one hand as she moved between tables. 26 years old, graceful and composed, she had learned how to navigate rooms full of powerful people without drawing attention to herself. Her uniform was immaculate. Her posture was effortless. Most guests barely noticed her. That was fine. Naomi had long ago discovered that people revealed their true selves when they believed no one was watching. As she passed a cluster of executives near the dance floor, she heard laughter erupt. She smiled politely and continued walking. Then her attention shifted. Near the edge of the room stood a boy alone. Not physically alone. His father was only a few feet away. But loneliness has never been measured in feet. It lives somewhere deeper. Naomi noticed the way Mason avoided eye contact. The way he stood slightly turned away from the crowd. The way he seemed to shrink whenever someone glanced in his direction. She had seen that look before. Not the scars. The sadness behind them. A server approached Naomi carrying empty glasses. "Who's the kid?" he whispered. Naomi followed his gaze. "That's Ethan Caldwell's son." "Poor kid," the server said before walking away. Naomi didn't answer. Something about those 2 words bothered her. Poor kid. People always thought sympathy was kindness. Sometimes it was just another way of reminding someone they were different. Across the ballroom, the quartet finished its song. Applause rippled through the crowd. Another melody began. Softer. Older. The kind of song that carried memories inside its notes. Mason's head lifted for the first time all evening. Only slightly. But Naomi noticed. And sometimes the smallest movement is where the biggest stories begin. The music drifted through the ballroom like a memory searching for someone who had forgotten how to hope. Mason remained still, but Naomi noticed something different. The boy who had spent the evening staring at the floor was now listening. Really listening. His shoulders relaxed slightly. His eyes followed the melody as if he recognized it from somewhere far away. Across the room, guests continued their conversations. Deals were discussed. Laughter echoed beneath the chandeliers. Waiters moved between tables carrying silver trays and sparkling glasses. To everyone else, it was another elegant night in Manhattan. But for Mason Caldwell, it felt like standing in the middle of a crowd while being completely invisible. Ethan watched his son carefully. Years of fatherhood had taught him to recognize the smallest changes. A lifted eyebrow, a longer glance, A moment of curiosity. These tiny signals had become precious, because there had been a time when Mason could not sit still for more than 10 seconds. A time when every room became a stage. Every hallway became a dance floor. Every song became an invitation. Those memories felt distant now, like photographs fading inside an old album. Mason shifted his weight and looked toward the quartet. It lasted only a moment before he caught a nearby guest staring. Instantly, his gaze dropped again. The walls returned. Ethan felt his chest tighten. Some wounds were invisible. Those were often the hardest to heal. Nearby, Naomi set down a tray of empty glasses and continued observing from a respectful distance. She had worked hundreds of events over the years. She knew how to read people. The wealthy executive pretending to listen. The politician rehearsing smiles. The lonely spouse standing beside success without feeling part of it. But there was something about Mason that pulled at her attention. Maybe it was because she recognized loneliness when she saw it. Maybe it was because she remembered being 12 herself, feeling like she did not belong anywhere. Or maybe it was simply because she noticed what others missed. The music changed again. This time the melody carried a slower rhythm. Warm, familiar, gentle. One of the violinists smiled as he played. Several couples drifted toward the dance floor. Shoes glided across polished marble. Dresses shimmered beneath the lights. Conversations softened as the music filled the room. Naomi caught something out of the corner of her eye. Mason was watching the dancers. Not casually, intently. His attention never left the floor. Every turn, every step, every movement. It was almost as if his body remembered something his mind had tried to forget. Before she could stop herself, Naomi smiled. Then she saw it. The smallest reaction. Mason almost smiled back. Almost. The expression appeared and disappeared in less than a second. But it was there. A tiny crack in a wall built over years. Ethan saw it too. His breath caught. Hope can be dangerous when you have spent years being disappointed. Still, for one brief moment, he allowed himself to believe. Then a group of guests approached. Business associates. Investors. Well-meaning people who wanted to say hello. Mason immediately stepped backward. His posture closed. His eyes returned to the floor. The moment vanished. Ethan greeted them politely, but frustration lingered beneath every word. Nobody meant harm. That was the cruel part. Most people were trying to be kind. Yet every careful glance and every awkward expression reminded Mason that he was different. Naomi stood near the refreshment station, watching the scene unfold. Her grandmother used to tell her something when she was young. People do not always need fixing. Sometimes they only need someone willing to see them. As another song began, Naomi looked toward the dance floor, then back at Mason. A thought crossed her mind. Simple, unexpected, maybe even ridiculous. But sometimes the smallest decisions change everything. And before the night was over, one simple decision would place her on a path neither she nor the Caldwell family could have imagined. Naomi did not know why she kept looking toward Mason. She only knew that something about the boy reminded her of a younger version of herself. Not the scars, not the silence, the feeling. The feeling of standing in a crowded room and somehow feeling completely alone. She picked up a fresh tray of sparkling water and made her way across the ballroom. The closer she came, the more she noticed the details others missed. Mason was not watching the people dancing anymore. He was studying them, watching their feet, following their rhythm, memorizing every movement as if he were reading a language he once spoke fluently. Ethan noticed Naomi approaching and offered a polite nod. Years of attending events like this had trained him to acknowledge staff members with quiet professionalism. Naomi returned the gesture and offered Mason a glass of water. "You look like you know more about dancing than anyone on that floor," she said casually. Mason blinked. The comment caught him off guard. Most people either ignored him or tried too hard to make him feel comfortable. Very few spoke to him normally. "Not really," he replied. "Maybe a little." Naomi smiled. "That sounds like something somebody says when they are actually very good." A tiny spark appeared in Mason's eyes before disappearing again. Ethan watched silently. It had taken less than 30 seconds for Naomi to get more words from his son than many adults managed all evening. "Do you dance?" Mason asked unexpectedly. Naomi laughed softly. "Not anymore." "Why not?" She glanced toward the dance floor where couples moved beneath golden light. "Life happened." Mason nodded as though he understood more than a 12-year-old should. In some ways, he probably did. Naomi rested the tray against her hip. "When I was younger, I thought I would dance forever. Were you good? Mason asked. Good enough to dream about it. For the first time that night, the corner of Mason's mouth lifted slightly. It was not a full smile. It was not even close. But it was there. Ethan felt something shift inside him. The moment was so small that nobody else would have noticed. Yet for a father who had spent years searching for signs of hope, it felt enormous. Naomi did not press further. She had learned long ago that trust grows quietly. Push too hard, and it disappears. Instead, she glanced toward the musicians. That song earlier, she said. You liked it? Mason looked surprised. How did you know? Because you stopped looking at the floor. He lowered his head again, embarrassed. It was my mom's favorite kind of music. The words came out so quietly that they almost vanished beneath the music. Ethan's expression changed. A shadow crossed his face. Naomi immediately understood she had stepped near something important. She had good taste, Naomi said gently. Mason looked toward the dancers again. This time he did not look away immediately. She used to dance with me in the kitchen, he admitted. Every Saturday morning. The memory seemed to hang in the air between them, warm and fragile. Ethan swallowed hard and turned slightly toward the ballroom windows. Outside, the lights of Manhattan glittered against the night sky. Inside, something unexpected was happening. A boy who had spent years protecting himself from disappointment was beginning to talk. And a waitress who had simply chosen to treat him like a person instead of a tragedy was slowly opening a door everyone else thought had been locked forever. Naomi should have walked away then. Another table needed service. Another guest was raising a hand for a refill. The ballroom continued moving around them like a river of light and conversation. But something told her to stay. Maybe it was the way Mason had spoken about his mother. Maybe it was the look Ethan carried whenever his son mentioned the past. Some stories leave traces in the people who survive them. She must have been a great dancer, Naomi said softly. Mason nodded. The best. His answer came without hesitation. She used to say every song tells the truth about somebody. Naomi smiled. I like that. For a moment, the boy looked older than 12. Not because of the scars. Not because of the sadness. Because grief has a way of adding years to a person. Ethan finally turned back from the window. She really did say that, he said quietly. A faint smile appeared on his face. It was the first genuine smile Naomi had seen from him all evening. Every Saturday morning, Ethan continued. The kitchen became a dance studio. Mason glanced at his father. You hated it. I did not hate it. You said nobody should be dancing before coffee. Naomi laughed. Ethan shook his head. That part is true. The sound surprised all three of them. It felt normal. Simple. The kind of conversation families have every day without realizing how valuable those moments are. Then something unexpected happened. One of the musicians began speaking, with a guest near the stage. Naomi glanced over and froze. The guest pointed toward Mason while showing something on a phone screen. The musician looked interested. Naomi followed the exchange for several seconds before returning her attention to the boy. Can I ask you something? She said. Mason shrugged. Okay. Did you ever perform? Ethan looked at her immediately. Mason looked confused. What do you mean? Naomi tilted her head. The way you watch dancers. The way you listen to music. That is not how beginners watch. Silence settled between them. Mason looked down at his shoes. Ethan exhaled slowly. The answer was written across both their faces. Naomi suddenly realized she had stumbled onto something important. I used to compete, Mason admitted. The words came out quietly. Competitive ballroom. Naomi blinked. Seriously? He nodded. Before. That single word carried an entire world inside it. Before. Before everything changed. Before people looked at him differently. Before he stopped stepping onto dance floors. Before confidence became something he remembered instead of something he felt. Naomi stared at him. You were a dancer. Mason gave a tiny shrug. I guess. Ethan laughed softly, though sadness lingered beneath it. State champion at 10 years old. Naomi turned toward him in disbelief. You are kidding. I wish I were. Ethan reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his phone. A few taps later he handed it over. Naomi looked at the screen. The video showed a younger Mason spinning confidently across a brightly lit stage. Fast feet. Perfect timing. A huge smile. The kind of smile that reached all the way to his eyes. Naomi looked from the video to the boy standing beside her. They barely seemed like the same person. Wow, she whispered. Mason immediately looked uncomfortable. That was a long time ago. Ethan's expression darkened slightly. Not from anger. From regret. Not as long as you think, he said. But Mason did not answer. His gaze drifted back toward the dance floor, where couples continued moving beneath the chandeliers. For a brief second, longing appeared in his eyes. Then the wall returned. The same wall he had spent years building. The same wall everyone else accepted. Everyone except Naomi. Because now she knew something nobody had told her before. The lonely boy standing at the edge of the ballroom was not simply watching the dancers. He was remembering the person he used to be. Naomi handed the phone back to Ethan, but her eyes remained on Mason. The video she had just seen refused to leave her mind. The confidence, the joy, the freedom. It was all still there somewhere beneath the silence, standing beside her. Most people would have let the moment pass. Most people would have offered a polite compliment and moved on. Naomi was not most people. She glanced toward the dance floor again. The music had shifted into a slower rhythm, elegant and inviting. More guests were joining. Some moved gracefully. Others laughed through missteps. Nobody seemed worried about being perfect. I have a challenge for you, Naomi said suddenly. Mason looked up. A challenge. One step. He frowned. What? One step, she repeated. That is it. Mason immediately shook his head. No, the answer came so fast that it almost made Ethan smile. Naomi expected resistance. Fear often answered before courage had a chance to speak. I am serious, she said. Not a performance. Not a competition. Not even a dance. Mason folded his arms. Then what is it? Naomi pointed toward the edge of the ballroom, where a small section of polished floor remained empty. One step. Mason followed her gaze and quickly looked away. No, why? Because people will stare. The words landed heavily. Honest. Unfiltered. The kind of truth adults spend years learning to hide. Naomi nodded. Maybe. Mason looked vindicated. See? But they are already staring. The boy froze. Ethan's eyes widened slightly. Naomi's voice remained gentle. There was no judgment in it. Only honesty. Some stare because they are curious, she continued. Some stare because they do not know what to say. Some stare because they notice someone strong enough to keep showing up even when it is hard. Mason looked unconvinced. You do not know that. Maybe not. Naomi smiled. But I do know this. If you spend your whole life hiding from other people's eyes, eventually you stop seeing yourself. Silence settled between them. The orchestra continued playing. Glasses clinked. Laughter drifted through the ballroom. Yet for Mason, the room suddenly felt very small. Ethan watched his son carefully. Part of him wanted to stop the conversation. Another part desperately wanted it to continue. For years he had tried everything. Encouragement, patience, therapy, time. Nothing had reached Mason quite like this simple exchange. Naomi took a small step backward. Then another. Look, she said. I will make it easy. Mason raised an eyebrow. How? If you can take one step toward the dance floor, I will take the next one. That is your challenge. That is my challenge. Mason stared at her. The idea sounded ridiculous. Maybe that was why it worked. There was no pressure. No audience. No expectation. Just one step. Naomi extended her hand. Not close enough to force a decision. Just close enough to offer one. One step, she repeated. Ethan held his breath. Mason looked at the hand. Then at the dance floor. Then at the hundreds of people surrounding them. Fear battled with memory. Doubt battled with longing. Somewhere deep inside him, the boy from the old video stirred. The boy who once danced without thinking about who might be watching. The music swelled softly beneath the chandeliers. Naomi waited. Ethan waited. The entire future of the evening seemed balanced on a moment so small that nobody else in the ballroom even noticed it existed. Then Mason shifted his weight forward. Mason took one step. It was barely 6 inches. A movement so small that nobody across the ballroom noticed. Yet for Ethan, it felt as if the entire room had shifted beneath his feet. Naomi smiled immediately. Not the exaggerated smile adults sometimes use when speaking to children. A real smile. The kind that says, I knew you could do it. True to her word, she took one step forward as well. See, she said lightly. Now we are even. Mason almost laughed. Almost. The sound caught somewhere between disbelief and amusement. That was not dancing, he said. I never said it was. Naomi took another step. Your turn. Mason shook his head. You are tricking me. Absolutely. Her honesty surprised him enough to make him look up. For the first time all evening, their conversation felt effortless. No careful questions. No awkward sympathy. No reminders that he was different. Just two people talking. The orchestra shifted into another melody. Warm strings floated through the ballroom like sunlight through an open window. Couples continued gliding across the floor. Nearby conversations softened as guests became drawn toward the music. Mason glanced toward the dancers. Then, before he could overthink it, he took a second step. Naomi immediately matched it. Then a third. Then a fourth. Ethan stood frozen near the edge of the ballroom. He did not dare interrupt. Hope is a fragile thing. Sometimes even a word can break it. Several guests had begun noticing. Not because they recognized Mason Caldwell. Not because they knew who Ethan was. They noticed because there was something quietly beautiful about the scene unfolding before them. A waitress and a boy moving toward a dance floor one careful step at a time. No spotlight. No announcement. No performance. Just courage arriving in small pieces. Mason reached the edge of the polished floor and stopped. The lights reflected beneath his shoes. The music felt louder here. So did his heartbeat. That counts, he said quickly. I made it. Naomi folded her arms playfully. Made it where? The dance floor. You were standing next to it. Mason narrowed his eyes. That still counts. Nice try. For a second, he looked exactly like the boy from the video Ethan had shown her. Competitive. Determined. Alive. Naomi extended her hand again. One more step. Mason stared at it. Around them, the ballroom seemed to slow down. Not because people were watching. Most were not. But because certain moments carry a weight that can only be understood afterward. Moments when a person stands at the edge of fear and decides who they want to become. Ethan felt his pulse pounding in his ears. He remembered dance competitions, early morning practices, trophy shelves, Saturday mornings filled with music and laughter. Memories he had locked away because remembering hurt too much. Mason swallowed hard. Every instinct told him to retreat, to return to the safety of the wall, to become invisible again. Then he heard his mother's voice. Not literally. Memory rarely works that way. It was simply a feeling. A Saturday morning. Sunlight through kitchen windows. Music playing from an old speaker. Her laughter. Her hand reaching toward him. Dance first. Worry later. The memory hit him like a warm breeze. Before fear could argue, Mason stepped forward. One foot crossed onto the dance floor. Then the other. Naomi smiled softly. Ethan covered his mouth with one trembling hand. And somewhere deep inside the ballroom, something long asleep began to wake. The instant both of Mason's feet settled on the dance floor, something unexpected happened. Nothing dramatic. No applause. No grand announcement. The world did not stop turning. The orchestra continued playing. Guests continued talking. Glasses continued clinking beneath the chandeliers. Yet for Mason, it felt as though he had just crossed an ocean. Naomi did not rush him. She did not celebrate. She simply stood beside him as though being there was the most natural thing in the world. See, she said softly. You survived. Mason rolled his eyes. Barely. Naomi laughed. Very dramatic. To her surprise, he laughed too. The sound was brief, but real. Ethan heard it from across the room and felt his heart stumble. It had been so long. Longer than he wanted to admit. Nearby, a few guests noticed the exchange and smiled before returning to their conversations. Nobody was treating Mason like a spectacle. Nobody was whispering. Nobody seemed concerned about the scars he had spent years believing were the first thing everyone saw. For the first time all evening, he began noticing something different. Most people were not looking at him at all. They were simply enjoying the music. The realization unsettled him. Had he spent years carrying a fear larger than reality itself? Before he could answer that question, the orchestra transitioned into another song. The first few notes floated through the ballroom like a familiar voice calling from another room. Ethan froze. His expression changed instantly. Across the dance floor, Mason's head lifted. Naomi noticed both reactions immediately. The melody was gentle. Piano first. Then strings. Warm. Nostalgic. Timeless. Mason's eyes widened. No way, he whispered. Ethan took a slow step forward. He knew that song. He knew every note. Because years ago, it had filled their kitchen almost every weekend. It was not a famous song. Not one most people would recognize. It had been his wife's favorite recording. She played it while making pancakes. While cleaning the house. While teaching Mason new dance steps across worn hardwood floors. Ethan had not heard it in years. Not once. Not until tonight. Naomi looked between them, confused. "What is it?" she asked. Mason swallowed hard. "My mom loved this song." The words barely escaped his mouth. Suddenly the ballroom seemed quieter, not because the music softened, but because memory had entered the room. Mason stood motionless. The melody wrapped itself around old Saturday mornings, around laughter, around sunlight through kitchen windows, around moments he thought were gone forever. His eyes began to shine. Naomi felt her chest tighten. She had chosen none of this. She had not requested the song. She had not planned the moment. Yet somehow the exact music that lived inside Mason's happiest memories had found its way into the ballroom. "She used to dance to this every single weekend," he said quietly. Ethan looked away toward the windows, blinking rapidly. The city lights beyond the glass blurred for a moment. Around them, guests continued enjoying the gala without realizing that something extraordinary was unfolding only a few feet away. A boy who had spent years hiding from the world was standing in the center of a dance floor, while a forgotten piece of his childhood came back to life one note at a time. And for the first time that night, Mason did not want the song to end. Mason stood perfectly still as the melody carried him somewhere the ballroom could not see. The polished floor beneath his shoes disappeared. The chandeliers disappeared. Even the hundreds of guests faded into the background. For a few precious moments, he was back in a small kitchen filled with sunlight and laughter. He could almost smell pancakes on the stove, almost hear cabinets opening and closing, almost see his mother spinning across the floor with a wooden spoon in one hand and a smile that could brighten an entire house. Naomi watched the change happen in real time. The tension that usually lived in Mason's shoulders began to loosen. His eyes remained fixed somewhere far beyond the ballroom walls. Not lost, remembering. Nearby, Ethan felt his throat tighten. There are moments in life when success becomes meaningless. Moments when every accomplishment, every headline, every dollar loses its value. This was one of them. He had spent years trying to help his son find his way back to himself. He had hired experts from New York, Boston, Los Angeles, and Chicago. He had filled calendars with appointments and plans. He had done everything a father with unlimited resources could think to do. Yet somehow, the breakthrough arrived on an ordinary evening from a woman carrying a serving tray. The orchestra continued playing. The melody rose and fell like a gentle tide. Naomi took a small step backward, giving Mason space. Then something remarkable happened. His foot moved, not because anyone asked him to, not because he felt pressured, simply because the music invited him. One step, slow and careful, then another. His movements were hesitant at first, like someone testing whether an old bridge could still hold weight. Naomi smiled softly. She recognized what she was seeing. Muscle memory. The body remembering what fear had convinced the mind to forget. Mason shifted again, turned slightly. Then another step followed. The movements were simple, but they carried a grace that could not be taught overnight. Years of practice still lived inside him. Several nearby guests began noticing. Conversations softened. A few people paused with glasses halfway to their lips. Nobody interrupted. Nobody pointed. They simply watched. Not because of the scars. Not because of curiosity. Because there was something undeniably beautiful about witnessing someone rediscover a forgotten piece of themselves. Ethan blinked rapidly. A memory surfaced without warning. 3 years earlier. A quiet evening at home. Mason sitting on the edge of his bed after everything had changed. The room dark except for a lamp in the corner. His voice barely audible. "Dad." Ethan had looked up from a chair beside him. "Yeah, buddy." Mason stared at the floor for a long time before speaking again. "Nobody is ever going to dance with me again." The sentence had shattered something inside Ethan. Not because he knew it was true, because he did not know how to convince his son it was not. Now, standing in the ballroom, that memory returned with devastating clarity. Ethan watched as Mason took another step. Then another. The boy was not performing. He was not trying to impress anyone. He was simply allowing himself to exist inside the music again. Ethan pressed a hand against his mouth. His eyes filled despite every attempt to remain composed. Around him, the city's most powerful people had no idea they were witnessing the most important victory of his life. Not a business deal. Not an acquisition. Not a company milestone. Just a boy finding his way back to joy one step at a time. The final notes of the song lingered in the air like the last rays of sunlight before evening. Nobody rushed to speak. Nobody wanted to break the moment. Mason stood at the center of the dance floor, breathing slightly harder than before, his eyes bright in a way Ethan had not seen in years. The ballroom remained wrapped in a rare kind of silence, the kind created not by sadness, but by people witnessing something real. Then it happened. A smile spread across Mason's face. Not the careful smile he practiced in mirrors. Not the polite smile he used when adults expected one. This was different. It arrived naturally and stayed. For a second, he looked exactly like the boy from those old videos. The boy who filled every room with energy. The boy who believed every song was an invitation. Ethan felt tears slip free before he could stop them. He lowered his head and laughed quietly at himself. A billionaire who negotiated billion-dollar deals without blinking was standing in the middle of a charity gala, unable to hold back tears because his son smiled. Yet nothing in his life had ever felt more important. Naomi noticed and gently stepped back, allowing father and son their moment. She never wanted attention. She had not set out to change anyone's life. She had simply offered kindness without conditions. Sometimes that is enough. Mason looked toward his father. "Dad." Ethan quickly wiped his eyes. "Yeah, buddy." The boy hesitated. Then another smile appeared. "I forgot how much I missed that." Ethan swallowed hard. "Me too." They stood there looking at each other while years of fear, frustration, and heartbreak quietly loosened their grip. Around them, conversations slowly resumed. The orchestra prepared for another song. The gala continued. Yet something fundamental had changed. Mason glanced toward Naomi. "Thank you," he said. The words were simple, but they carried more weight than anyone else in the room could understand. Naomi smiled. "You did all the hard part." Mason shook his head. "No. You asked." For a moment, Naomi could not answer. Because he was right. Sometimes healing begins with something as small as a question. A hand extended. A chance offered. Ethan walked toward her. "I do not think I can ever properly thank you," he said. Naomi laughed softly. "You do not have to." "I do." He looked toward his son. "For 3 years I kept trying to fix everything. Tonight you reminded me that maybe my job was never to fix him. Maybe it was to help him remember who he already was." Naomi glanced at Mason standing beneath the chandeliers. I think he remembered. Later, as guests began leaving and the lights of Manhattan shimmered beyond the ballroom windows, Mason stopped beside Naomi one final time. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course." He looked down briefly before meeting her eyes again. "Do you think scars ever disappear?" Naomi considered the question carefully. Then she smiled. "No, but sometimes they stop being the first thing people see." Mason stood quietly for a second. Then he nodded. The answer seemed to settle somewhere deep inside him. As he walked back toward his father, Ethan placed an arm around his shoulders, and together they headed toward the exit. The city waited outside. So did tomorrow. But tonight was different. Tonight a boy discovered. He was more than the hardest chapter of his life. Tonight a father learned that hope can return when you least expect it. And tonight, in a ballroom filled with wealth and influence, the most valuable thing anyone carried home was a smile that money could never buy.